The passage we're discussing today is quite lengthy, and for this reason, we'll not read it in its entirety here at the beginning of our time together. But the passage we're considering can be found in Deuteronomy chapter 26, verse 16 through chapter 29, verse 1. And we'll begin by reading only Deuteronomy chapter 26, verses 16 to 19. This is the word of Yahweh. This very day, Yahweh your Elohim is commanding you to observe these statutes and ordinances. So observe them diligently with all your heart and with all your soul. Today you have obtained Yahweh's agreement to be your Elohim, and for you to walk in his ways, to keep his statutes, his commandments, and his ordinances, and to obey him. Today Yahweh has obtained your agreement to be his treasured people as he promised you, and to keep his commandments, for him to set you high above all nations that he has made, in praise and in fame and in honor, and for you to be a people holy to Yahweh your Elohim as he promised. Nothing in this world remains static. People and things change over time, and so it's not surprising that covenants must be renewed. The covenant that God had made with the people of Israel at Mount Sinai was 40 years old at the time of Moses' speech recorded in Deuteronomy. All of the adults who had agreed to that covenant, save Moses, Joshua, and Caleb, had died. The congregation of people who stood before Moses in the region of Moab in Deuteronomy had been children at Sinai. So before beginning the conquest of the Promised Land, God renewed his covenantal promises with the children of those who had stood before him at Sinai, and God asked that they too commit themselves to the covenant of Sinai as had their parents before them. And this is not an unusual behavior on the part of God. We might recall that after having made several covenants with Abraham, God renewed his covenant promises to Abraham's son Isaac and to Isaac's son Jacob. God does not appear to assume that each generation of a family will agree to that which their forebears agreed, and so God renews his covenant with each successive generation. This reality is embodied in the annual pilgrimage festivals of Israel, and it continues to be embodied today in the festival of the Bar and Bat Mitzvah in Judaism and in confirmation in many Christian communities. According to Deuteronomy chapter 26, verses 16 to 19, each successive generation is to read and renew the stipulations of the covenant as though the covenant was being presented specifically to them at that very moment. God's promises are not only for those who lived in the past, but they are promises to those of us who are now living. Christians may not be in relationship with God today by means of the covenant of Sinai, but as was true with the covenant of Sinai, so it remains true in the new covenant of Jesus. Each generation must renew their covenantal vows to Jesus. God does not have grandchildren. God has only sons and daughters who are in covenanted relationship with him. For all who come to God by faith in Jesus, committing themselves to submit to Jesus as Lord and to obey his way and word, God says again what he said to Israel through Moses. Today you have obtained Yahweh's agreement to be your Elohim and for you to walk in his ways, to keep his statutes, his commandments, and his ordinances, and to obey him. Today Yahweh has obtained your agreement to be his treasured people as he promised you, and to keep his commandments, for him to set you high above all nations that he has made, in praise and in fame and in honor, and for you to be a people holy to Yahweh your Elohim as he promised. No parent can make this commitment for his or her children. Once a child reaches an age of accountability before God, the child himself or herself must embrace God's covenant which has come to them by the grace of God through faith. Following these verses, Moses reiterated the following in Deuteronomy chapter 27, verse 1. Then Moses and the elders of Israel charged all the people as follows: Keep the entire commandment that I am commanding you today. Then Moses instructed the people in Deuteronomy chapter 27, verses 2 to 8, to set up stones on a mountain in Israel, a mountain called Mount Ebal, to cover those stones with plaster, and to write all the words of the covenant upon them. Then they were to build an altar of unhewn stones, offer sacrifices to God, and then eat a celebratory feast. Then Moses and the Levitical priests spoke to all Israel, saying, Keep silence and hear, O Israel. This very day you have become the people of Yahweh your Elohim. Therefore obey Yahweh your Elohim, observing his commandments and his statutes that I am commanding you today. After the future conquest of the land of Canaan, Moses commanded the people to separate the tribes into two groups, placing one group on Mount Gerizim and the other on Mount Ebal. Now, Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal are found in the central hill country of Israel, in the tribe of Manasseh. Mount Ebal was found just north of the city of Shechem, and Mount Gerizim just south of the city. Then Moses commanded the Levites to declare curses against those who violate the covenant in a variety of ways, which are listed in Deuteronomy chapter 27, verses 15 through 26. Perhaps surprisingly, this is sort of a side note, some modern researchers have suggested that the unique acoustical properties of the Shechem Valley allows people to hear what is said on one mountain, both in the valley below and on the other mountain. However, even if this were not the case, the Levites could have been separated into two groups as well to accomplish what Moses required. But in any case, now the curse listed in verse 26 is a catch all curse, which curses any person who does not uphold all the words of the covenant. But even so, the specific behaviors that have been singled out for curses in verses 15 to 25 are worth noting. Especially worthy of cursing, according to God, are these: the artistic rendering of any idol or prohibited image, the dishonoring of father or mother, the moving of property lines, taking advantage of a blind person, depriving an immigrant, an orphan, or a widow of justice, having sexual intercourse with one's mother or stepmother, bestiality, having sexual intercourse with a full or half sister, having sexual intercourse with a spouse's parent, killing a person outside of the system of justice, and receiving money to kill an innocent person or to deprive them of justice. Now, obviously, these curses do not cover all of the stipulations of the covenant, but they are revelatory of the kinds of violations that God considers to be uniquely worthy of judgment and punishment. Of particular concern to God are the creation of things that might lead his people into the worship of false gods, the deprivation of justice or the ill treatment of those who lack the means or social standing fully to defend themselves, and sexual activities outside of a covenanted marriage relationship between a man and a woman from different households. It would seem that for God, artistic expressions, the treatment of the poor or disenfranchised, and sexual activities are areas which are particularly revelatory of a person and a community's willingness to submit to God and to God's will. If there is sin in the camp or rebellion in the heart, it will be apparent in one or all of these areas. The next question then is, what does God mean by curse? And that question will be answered shortly. But first, God delineates in Deuteronomy chapter 28, verses 1 through 14, what the consequences of obedience will be for the people. The passage begins in chapter 28, verse 1, by restating a now familiar theme. It says, "If you will only obey Yahweh your Elohim by diligently observing all his commandments that I am commanding you today." And if they did, God promised that obedience to the covenant of Sinai would result in Israel's being set high above the nations of the earth in both rural areas and in their cities in the following ways. Their fertility in all areas of life would be blessed, in the bearing of children, in the reproduction of their animals, and in crops. God would be with them in all they labored to accomplish. The Lord would protect them when attacked by enemies. The Lord would ensure that the nations of the earth feared them because of their relationship with him. But if the Israelites did not observe the stipulations of the covenant, then they would receive the following curses in both their cities and in their rural areas, and this list explains what God meant by curse in the earlier list. They, their animals, and their crops would be afflicted with infertility. God would be against them in all they labored to accomplish by sending disaster, panic, and frustration upon them until they are destroyed and perish. The Lord would afflict them with pestilence and disease, including all the diseases that he sent upon the Egyptians when he delivered Israel from their grasp. The Lord would afflict them with fiery heat and drought. The Lord would afflict them with blight and mildew. The Lord would no longer hear their prayers or respond to their requests. The Lord would cause them to be defeated by their enemies. The Lord would afflict them with madness, blindness, and confusion, as he afflicted the inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis chapter 19. God would ensure that the Israelites could not enjoy the fruits of their labors. The Lord would not protect them from the theft of their goods or their land. And the Lord finally would allow them to be taken into exile by their enemies. In short, their rebellion against their covenantal promises would result in the total devastation of their nation, socially, economically, judicially, religiously, and politically. Now, these stipulations and expectations may have been given to the ancient people of Israel in 1446 BC and renewed here in these verses around 1406 BC. But the Covenant of Sinai still reveals God's general expectations for any nation at any time and in any place. One of the reasons that the New Covenant of Jesus does not include some of these warnings of national apostasy is because the Christian community has been intended by God to be a community in exile for the sake of the nations and peoples of the earth, as the salt of the earth, to use an analogy first used by Jesus. Because Christian communities live within other nations and are not intended by God to be nations themselves, some of the national warnings to Israel do not apply in the same way. God's judgment of Christian communities, therefore, are to be more local and contextual, as can be seen, for instance, in the 7 letters that St. John wrote in the book of Revelation. However, God still expects a certain level of social, economic, and cultural decorum from the nations of the earth. It was for violations, such as those described in Deuteronomy chapter 27, that God destroyed the entirety of the earth in the Great Flood. It was for violations such as these that God destroyed the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. It was for violations such as these that God condemned the nations of Canaan to destruction. It was for violations such as these that God allowed Israel to be destroyed and sent into exile. And it was for violations such as these that God later destroyed the Assyrian, Babylonian, Medo-Persian, Greek, and the initial permutation of the Roman empires. Any nation that fails to recognize the God of Israel as God and fails to submit to his teachings and guidelines in thanksgiving to him, after a season of merciful forbearance and prophetic warnings determined by the grace of God alone, will be judged as God warned Israel. And as we have seen, of particular concern to God are a culture's artistic expressions, treatment of the poor or disenfranchised, and sexual activities. Furthermore, when God has decided to bring judgment on a nation or people, they will be warned by a series of curses which, if a nation does not turn back from its wickedness, will increase in severity until the nation is destroyed. And those curses are, once again, infertility, pestilence, disease, natural and human-made disasters, panic, frustration, madness, mental confusion, fiery heat, drought, blight, mildew, increases in theft and lawless activities, defeat at the hands of their enemies, the refusal of God to hear their prayers or to intervene on their behalf, and finally, destruction and exile. These curses have accosted the nations of the earth for so many millennia that many of us alive today just see these things as the normal course of life on earth. But we've been deceived by our experience. Life did not have to be this way. God offered Israel a different sort of existence, one in which these curses were not commonplace, but rare and uncommonly experienced. Now, God, of course, did not offer the same kinds of protections to other nations as he did to Israel, which in part accounts for the differing experiences of Gentile nations with suffering and tragedy. However, these curses are signs of God's displeasure and increasing distance from a nation. Any nation riddled with these consequences is revealed to be far from God and from his way. The question then each of us must ask is this: how does my nation and my culture weigh on God's scale of just and right societies? May those who have ears to hear listen to what the Spirit is saying to the churches. Amen.